He left her over a lie, but at a gala 4 years later, the truth stared back at him with his own eyes. 4 years ago, Juliet was on the platform of the train station. Her hands trembled slightly as they clutched a sealed envelope she had written a dozen times and rewritten a dozen more. It was addressed to Ethan Vance, the man she loved and the man she thought she would share her life with. In that envelope were the words she couldn't say face to face, that she was pregnant, that she needed him, that she wasn't strong enough to do this alone. But just days before, she had learned the news that shattered her. Ethan was marrying Olivia, a glamorous blonde who claimed she was expecting his child. Juliet remembered how her legs gave out beneath her when she saw the headline of the engagement, the same photograph of them plastered all over the internet. Olivia's hand resting possessively on his chest, her diamond ring catching the light. It wasn't just that he had moved on, it was that he had done so quickly, so thoroughly, without looking back. Juliet could barely breathe as she saw the train arrive. She had planned to go to his office that morning, planned to deliver the letter in person, planned to beg him to listen. But what was the point now? He had chosen. He had made his decision. And Olivia, with her soft manipulations and carefully calculated charm, had won. What Juliet didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Ethan had been just as stunned as she was when Olivia told him of the pregnancy. Yes, he had grown distant from Juliet, but he had never been unfaithful. Yet Olivia insisted the timing made sense, and Ethan, ever a man of logic and responsibility, had believed her. Juliet, unaware of his turmoil, boarded the train that would take her out of the city and out of his life, never looking back. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet, numbing devastation. Juliet moved to a small apartment on the city's outskirts, away from the sharp memories of the city and the reminders of a life that was no longer hers. She began working as a freelance graphic designer, taking on any client who would pay, and working late into the night just to afford prenatal vitamins and rent. When she went for her first ultrasound and saw 2 tiny heartbeats flickering on the screen, her chest ached with a bittersweet pain. Twins. She had never expected this. She had never planned for it. But in that moment, something changed. If Ethan wasn't going to be a part of their lives, then she would do it alone. She would be enough. She had to be. And she would never let him see her break. Juliet never spoke his name again. Not to her friends, not to her family. When her parents asked, she simply said they had broken up and changed the subject. She refused to give explanations. She refused to justify herself. The pain she carried was hers alone, and she buried it deep beneath layers of self-sufficiency and quiet determination. Each kick, each ultrasound, each sleepless night she endured without him made her stronger. It made her more certain that, although he had never truly loved her, her daughters would. And that would be enough. It had to be. Juliet's apartment was small, but every corner of it bore her marks, her stubborn efforts, and the echo of lullabies whispered in the silence of long nights. She had brought the girls home after a difficult delivery, exhausted, but filled with a fierce and protective love that made her feel at once invincible and painfully vulnerable. Ava and Mia, though born only minutes apart, had already begun to show their small personalities. Ava cried louder, was hungrier, demanded attention with fierce little fists and a steady gaze. Mia was quieter, but smart, always watching her sister, always curious, content just to be near. Juliet often sat between their bassinets, holding both of their hands at once, murmuring promises she never made out loud to anyone else. that she would never leave them, that she would never let them feel unwanted, that they would never know the weight of another person's rejection. The days blurred into nights as Juliet juggled the relentless rhythm of newborn life and the scramble of work. She built her freelance portfolio from scratch, sending proposals during midnight feedings and designing logos with a baby on each knee. Money was always tight. There were nights she skipped meals to afford formula, days she walked for miles instead of taking the bus so she could stretch her budget. The struggle exhausted her physically, and there were moments, brief and terrifying, when she would stand in the shower and let the water hide the sound of her crying, terrified she wouldn't be enough. That love wouldn't be enough. But every morning, when her daughters woke up and looked at her with those impossibly familiar blue eyes, his eyes, she found another thread of strength and held on tighter. There were days she thought of Ethan, not with bitterness, but with a quiet ache that never left her. She wondered if he ever thought of her, if he ever looked at Olivia and felt a pang of doubt. But then she would remember the headlines, the glossy photos from charity galas and tech awards, his arm always around Olivia's waist, his gaze always just distant enough to be unreadable. Maybe he had forgotten. Maybe she had never meant as much to him as he had to her. Juliet had no room for fantasies. She had to keep going. One step, one bill, one diaper at a time. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories. A quiet life. A rising success. When the girls turned 2, Juliet finally landed a steady client, a boutique design studio that admired her sharp eye and clean aesthetic. The work was demanding, but it allowed her to hire a part-time sitter and breathe. Just a little. She started painting again in the evenings, something she hadn't done since college, and for the first time in years, she felt something stirring in her that wasn't just about survival. Life was still hard, but it was hers. The twins became bright, energetic toddlers who filled the apartment with chaos and laughter. Ava was bold and brave, always the first to climb, the first to jump, the first to argue. Mia was quieter, but clever, always watching her sister, always curious, content just to be near. Juliet taught them to say please and thank you, to respect others, to ask questions, and most of all, to trust themselves. They didn't ask about their father often, and when they did, Juliet answered carefully, never with resentment, always with grace. "He's not with us, but you are loved more than you can ever imagine," she would tell them, and it was the truth. Still, deep in her heart, a silent longing remained, not for Ethan, but for justice, for truth, for the pieces of her story to finally make sense. She never sought revenge, never wished him ill, but she couldn't shake the feeling that one day, in some way, everything would come full circle. She didn't know when or how. She only knew that secrets have a way of coming to light, and she had nothing left to hide. By the time the girls turned 3, Juliet had begun to rebuild her life into something more than just manageable. The weight of survival that had once pressed down on her chest like a stone had lightened, replaced by a sense of purpose that came not only from being a mother, but from reclaiming herself as a woman, an artist, and a person who had dreams beyond just getting by. She had recently moved into a slightly larger apartment closer to the city's outskirts. It was one with a small balcony where the girls could grow potted flowers, and she could drink her coffee early in the morning before they woke up. The space still showed the signs of a modest life, but Juliet had learned to find beauty in simplicity. She hung her own artwork on the walls, filled the shelves with second-hand books, and let the girls spread their toys around without worrying about perfection. This was a home built on love, and despite the fatigue etched into her every movement, there was peace in knowing she had created it all with her own hands. Her career had begun to grow in ways she hadn't anticipated. The boutique studio she had partnered with started recommending her to other clients, and little by little she built a reputation in the design world as someone who could create visual stories with emotion and depth. She specialized in branding for small, women-owned businesses, often entrepreneurs who, like her, had started with nothing and were carving a path to visibility. Juliet connected with them, not just through her work, but through shared experience, and that empathy infused every project she touched. She still worked late into the night. She still answered emails during playground lunches. But now, the scramble carried hope. She could see a future taking shape in the distance, not just for her daughters, but for herself. Ava and Mia, now full of opinions and energy, had started attending a preschool just a few blocks away. Juliet would walk them every morning, one in each hand, their small voices filling the street with questions about trees and clouds and bugs. To strangers, they seemed like any other happy family, and Juliet let them believe it. She didn't owe the world her pain. The girls were thriving, smart, joyful, and so close, it was as if they shared the same thoughts before they spoke. They would finish each other's sentences, invent their own games, and had a silent language that only twins seemed to understand. Juliet often watched them with a bittersweet pang in her chest, wondering how long it would be before they started asking more complicated questions about their father. She had rehearsed the answers in her head 100 times, but never spoke them out loud. Not yet. Not until they were ready. The truth was heavy, and she had learned to carry it alone. Still, there were moments when the past would sneak in unannounced. One afternoon, while organizing files on her computer, she stumbled upon an old photo. Her and Ethan, before everything fell apart. They were at a lake, laughing, his arms around her shoulders. The kind of effortless intimacy that now felt like it belonged to another life. Her stomach twisted, not with longing, but with recognition. She hadn't been wrong about their connection. It had been real, which made his silence, his absence, all the more painful. Still, she closed the photo. She didn't delete it, but she didn't look at it again either. What Juliet didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that Ethan's world had begun to silently fracture. His company was thriving, his public image intact, but behind the scenes, the foundation he had built with Olivia was beginning to crumble. Their marriage, always more of a performance than a partnership, had become cold and tense. Olivia had everything money could buy, but lived with a corrosive fear that Ethan had never truly belonged to her. She could feel him slipping away more and more with each passing year, distracted, emotionally absent, often lost in his thoughts. He almost never looked at her anymore, and when he did, there was something in his eyes she couldn't name. Doubt, perhaps, or even worse, regret. Juliet, oblivious to the cracks spreading through Ethan's life, focused solely on her daughters. Her world was built around small, steady rituals, pancakes on Sunday mornings, trips to the local library, bedtime stories. Cuddled under a blanket, she gave herself to those moments, letting them anchor her through everything else. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. Every little giggle, every crayon drawing taped to the fridge, every "I love you, Mommy," whispered to her, reminded her that she had made the right choice. Even if the rest of the world never knew what she had sacrificed, her daughters did. And that was enough. At least it had to be. What do you think will be the trigger that finally brings Ethan and Juliet face to face again? Comment your thoughts below. The truth revealed. The charity gala was not something Juliet had planned on attending, but her friend from the design studio had begged her to go, insisting it would be a great opportunity to meet potential clients and showcase her work. The event was held in a sleek venue in the heart of the city, a dazzling space filled with chandeliers, polished marble floors, and too many people who pretended to care about the cause more than the photo opportunities. Juliet, dressed in a simple but beautifully made black dress she had borrowed from a friend, arrived with minimal expectations and even less desire to socialize. She had left the girls with her trusted neighbor, kissed them goodnight, and told herself she could survive a few hours of trivial conversation with champagne if it meant opening a new professional door. What she never anticipated was coming face to face with the past she had buried years ago. Ethan arrived late, as he often did when attending events more out of obligation than genuine interest. He had grown tired of these functions, of shaking hands with men who only wanted his money, and smiling at women who only wanted his name. Olivia, as always, had insisted they attend, but she had been unusually quiet that evening, distracted, her phone never far from her hand. He barely noticed. His mind had been elsewhere for weeks, haunted by memories that had resurfaced for no clear reason. An old perfume in a hallway, the laugh of a stranger in a cafe, a sketch he found in a magazine that reminded him of Juliet's work. Her name had also come up in a recent conversation from a colleague who mentioned hiring a brilliant designer for his new startup. The name hadn't clicked at first, but when he saw the portfolio, his chest tightened. It was her. It had to be. As Juliet stood near a small display of her donated artwork, sipping sparkling water and trying to avoid the gaze of anyone too curious, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned instinctively, prepared to offer a polite smile, but the breath left her body when she saw him. He was taller than she remembered, wider somehow, his features more defined, as if the years had chiseled him into someone colder, more distant. But his eyes, those unmistakable blue eyes, were the same, and they were looking directly at her, stunned and searching. Ethan didn't speak, neither did she. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, frozen in a bubble of disbelief that none of the dazzling lights or murmurs of the guests could penetrate. Juliet's heart was beating so violently she was afraid it might give her away, but she kept her expression calm, her posture still. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much his presence rattled her. But then her gaze flickered, just a little, over his shoulder, and the illusion was shattered. The twins had been brought by Juliet's friend for a brief, surprise visit, something she had planned to lift Juliet's spirits. She hadn't expected them to arrive so soon. Charlotte and Sophia, dressed in matching pastel sweaters and small silver shoes, ran to her, their giggles cutting through the ambient music like a knife. "Mommy!" they shouted in unison, and Juliet instinctively knelt, wrapping both of them in her arms. When she stood again, Ethan's face had completely changed. He looked at the girls as if he were seeing ghosts, his eyes fixed on theirs, and in that instant, he knew. There was no need for a DNA test or a whispered confession. They had his eyes, his expression, even the same way of tilting their heads when they were curious. The truth hit him like a tidal wave, washing away years of certainty, of decisions made based on lies. Olivia's pregnancy, the rushed marriage, the years of emotional detachment. It all began to crumble in his mind. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Juliet, her voice quiet and firm, simply said, "This isn't the time or the place." She turned and walked away with the girls, not running, not hiding, but refusing to let him reclaim the moment. Ethan stood motionless, surrounded by people who had no idea that his world had just been shattered. Olivia appeared at his side moments later, asking something meaningless, but he didn't hear her. His eyes were still fixed on the spot where Juliet had stood, the woman he had once loved, the woman he had left, and the daughters he never knew he had. He felt as if he had been asleep for years, and now, without warning, he had woken up in a different life, one that belonged to him, but one he had not had a hand in shaping. That night, long after the gala was over and the guests had gone home, Ethan sat alone in his study, with the untouched glass of whiskey in his hand. His phone lay face down on the desk beside him. For hours, he said nothing, did nothing. He simply sat in silence, listening to the sound of his own breathing, trying to reconcile the truth with the lies he had believed for too long. In his chest, something broke, not just pain, but something deeper. A slow, dawning understanding that everything he had built was meaningless if it had been built on a foundation of betrayal. He had been living someone else's version of his life, and now, for the first time in years, he wasn't sure who he really was. But he knew one thing for certain. He had to see Juliet again, and this time, she would get the truth she deserved. What do you think Ethan will do next? Will he confront Olivia? And what will he say to Juliet? Comment your thoughts below. The unraveling lie. Ethan left the gala with a heavy chest, and his thoughts unraveling in every direction. The image of the girls had followed him into the night, into his car, into his bed, where sleep never came. He turned the lights on, turned them off. He walked the length of his house like a stranger trapped inside someone else's walls. Their eyes haunted him most, blue like his, but brighter, untouched by regret. Every time he closed his own, he saw their faces peeking from behind Juliet's skirt, curious and innocent, as if they already knew who he was. By morning, his decision had already taken shape, though he feared it as much as he needed it. He had to know. The address came easily, as if it had been waiting for him all along, tucked away in memories he had tried to bury. When he stood on Juliet's doorstep, the sun was weak and pale, the kind of morning light that makes everything seem fragile. He didn't know how long he stood there before he knocked, listening to his pulse pound louder than the sound of his hand on the wood. When the door opened, Juliet was there, her hair a little wild, dressed simply, her eyes steady in a way that disarmed him. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask why he had come. She looked at him as if she had been waiting for this moment for years. He licked his lips but couldn't form the words. His throat was dry, his jaw tense, and yet, the only thing that came out of him was the question he had been choking on since last night. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice rough, almost unrecognizable to his own ears. Juliet didn't answer right away. Her silence stretched between them like a veil, and he realized he had been holding his breath. When she finally nodded, it wasn't with shame or with triumph, only with a quiet acceptance. "I wanted to tell you," she said softly, "but you had already left." The weight of her words hit him with the force of lost years, stolen years, years he could never get back. Behind her, he could see the faint evidence of a life built without him. Children's shoes by the wall, drawings taped to the fridge, 2 small jackets hung neatly on hooks. Every detail cut him, a reminder that he had missed the first steps, the first words, the first nights they cried, and she had comforted them alone. He felt his chest tighten, not with anger, but with a pain so deep it made his hands tremble. He left without arguing, without pleading. He needed air. He needed to stand outside her world before it swallowed him whole. On his way home, his vision blurred with thoughts he had refused to have before. Olivia's smile, too wide, too calculated. Her story of a pregnancy that had bound him to her, the sudden announcement that had felt like fate, but now sounded hollow. The way she had fragilely wrapped herself around his guilt. By the time he walked into his house, he was seeing her clearly for the first time in years. She was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, as if the world hadn't changed. And in that moment, he knew with certainty that everything he had endured, every choice that had led him here, had been built on a lie. The days that followed were a public storm, a spectacle of whispers, headlines, and accusations that spread faster than Ethan or Olivia could contain. The divorce began as a spark, a single declaration, but it quickly became a fire that drew the attention of neighbors, colleagues, and society pages. Olivia cried in court, her voice high and broken, first pleading with him to remember their vows, then threatening to ruin what was left of his reputation. She clung to memories that were already empty, fabricating sincerity where there had never been any. The world saw her tears, but Ethan, for the first time, saw past them, and what he felt was not fury, but an unyielding emptiness, as if the threads that had once tied him to his life had silently snapped in the night. When the truth came to light, when it was revealed that there had never been a child, never the loss he had grieved, there was no explosion within him, no violent rage demanding retribution. There was only a profound silence, a clarity he had never allowed himself to feel before. He remembered the nights he had lain next to Olivia, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, trying to force affection into the empty space between them. He remembered convincing himself that sacrifice was a kind of honor, that a man honored his promises no matter what. Now he understood it hadn't been honor, but blindness. And the fog of that blindness finally lifted. As the legal battles played out with their cruel efficiency, his footsteps began to lead him elsewhere, almost without thought. He found himself returning to Juliet's world in fragments, at first with hesitation, always carrying the weight of guilt that pressed against his chest like an unwanted guest. He didn't rush her. He knew he had no right to demand forgiveness simply because his own cage had shattered. Instead, he asked for the smallest of permissions, a conversation at her kitchen table, a moment to walk with her in the park while the girls ran ahead, a chance to bring them a storybook at night and stand in the doorway while she tucked them in. The rhythm of these visits became their own kind of healing. He began to see how Juliet lived, how she had built a life with quiet strength, how the girls filled her days with laughter, chaos, and an exhaustion she bore with grace. In the park, he learned to chase them, to lift them high onto his shoulders until they shrieked with joy, to sit cross-legged on the grass, answering their endless questions. He noticed how they leaned into him naturally, without hesitation, as if some instinct had already told them who he was long before he had said it out loud. And then there were the silences, those long stretches of time where he and Juliet spoke without words. She would watch him awkwardly braid a doll's hair or struggle with the small clasps on a pair of shoes, and he could feel the walls between them shifting. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a softening, a quiet acknowledgement that he was trying. At night, when he returned to an empty house stripped of Olivia's perfume and staged perfection, he found himself clinging to those moments more tightly than to anything else. The scandal raged around him, but Ethan no longer cared. Lawyers argued, journalists speculated. Olivia performed her grief for an audience that was growing tired of her theatrics. But he had already moved past it all. Each day with Juliet and the girls became a thread. Delicate, but real, weaving something new from the ruins of his old life. He began to understand that what he sought was not to erase the past, but to build a present that could last. And for the first time in years, he felt the faint warmth of hope pressing against the cold edges of his chest. What do you think is the biggest challenge for Ethan to truly become a father to the girls. Will Juliet ever fully trust him again? Comment your thoughts below. A new beginning, Charlotte and Sophia accepted Ethan into their lives with a joy so natural it stunned him. To them, his absence wasn't a wound, but a gap that could be easily bridged, as if he had simply been away on a long business trip and was now returning home. They tugged on his sleeves with sticky hands, demanded his attention with giggles and stubbornness, and welcomed him into their games as if he had always been a part of their world. At first, he felt clumsy, unsure in every gesture, afraid of breaking the fragile rhythm of their childhood with his heavy footsteps. He would get tangled in shoelaces and hair elastics, struggle to balance the small clasps on a pair of shoes, and spend long minutes deciphering the building manuals for Lego castles that always seemed impossible to him, but effortless for them. Juliet would watch him with amusement, correcting him without judgment. And when he finally got it right, their cheers would fill the room with a warmth that shook him to his core. The bedtime routines were the hardest, and also the most rewarding. Reading aloud was foreign to him. His voice felt too rough, too firm, as if it didn't belong in the soft glow of a child's room. But when Charlotte would snuggle into his side, and Sophia would rest her head on his arm, his breathing deepened as he turned the pages, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. He learned that the pauses mattered more than the words, that they loved it when he made the wolves sound silly, and when the princesses were brave instead of helpless. It was in those quiet moments, surrounded by the weight of small bodies that trusted him without hesitation, that Ethan realized how much of life he had missed. He thought about the years that had passed, about the nights Juliet must have stood alone by these very beds, whispering comfort while he lay awake somewhere else, believing lies. Juliet watched him from a distance in those first few weeks, her gaze cautious, but not cold. She studied the way he would crouch down to tie a shoe, how he let the girls braid his hair with plastic clips until he looked ridiculous, how he answered their endless questions with a patience she never knew he possessed. She didn't rush to forgive, and he didn't ask her to. He knew forgiveness couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned slowly, like trust rebuilt one stone at a time. There were moments when their eyes would meet across a room, and the weight of the past would press heavily between them. Moments when the silence would stretch long enough to remind them of everything that had been broken. Yet, in those very silences, there was also something more. A new, fragile possibility that neither of them dared to name. For Ethan, the transformation was not sudden, but gradual, unfolding in small victories. He learned how to pack a school backpack without forgetting the snacks, to braid hair with softer fingers, to tend a scraped knee without panicking. Each new task, however simple, became a milestone, a proof that he was no longer just a man defined by betrayal and regret, but a father learning to exist in his daughter's world. The clumsiness that had once marked his presence began to fade, replaced by something natural, something steady. He found himself anticipating their laughter, their hugs, even their tantrums, because it was all real. It all belonged to the life he had once thought was forever beyond his reach. Juliet saw it too. She noticed how his shoulders, once rigid and burdened, began to relax. How the lines on his face would soften when he listened to the girls chatter about their day. How his voice changed when he spoke to them. Soft, patient, unlike the reserved tone she remembered from before. She didn't abandon her caution, but she no longer held on to the resentment with the same iron-willed determination. Something in her began to give way, like ice slowly thawing under the spring sun. She had built walls to protect herself and her children, But Ethan hadn't tried to knock them down with force. Instead, he had stood before them day after day, not demanding entry, but simply waiting, showing through action instead of promises that he intended to stay. As the months passed, Ethan discovered that fatherhood wasn't just about being present, but about listening, about learning, about showing up, even when he was exhausted or unsure. It was in the small questions, the quiet gestures, the willingness to sit on the floor surrounded by dolls and blocks after a long day. It was in the way the girls looked at him, as if he were their hero, simply for existing beside them. And slowly, in the rhythm of their shared days, Ethan felt that a second chance was taking root. It was not a repetition of what he and Juliet had once been, but something entirely new, fragile, yet resilient, a reinvention rather than a return. He carried the weight of the past, but he no longer let it crush him, because for the first time, he was not living in duty or lies. He was living in truth. A year later, the memory of that night at the gala still lingered in Ethan's mind, no longer as a wound, but as a point of origin, the moment his life had changed from illusion to truth. Time had stretched and bent since then, weaving days filled with ordinary chores and unexpected joys. By the time Charlotte and Sophia were ready for their preschool graduation, he had become so much a part of their world that sometimes even he struggled to remember what it had been like to live without them. The morning of the ceremony, he found himself nervously straightening their small dresses as they twirled impatiently in front of the mirror, demanding his approval for ribbons and barrettes. Juliet watched from the doorway with an amused smile, handing him the comb when he faltered, their eyes meeting in a quiet acknowledgement of how far things had come. In the school, the hall buzzed with the laughter of parents and the squeals of children, decorations taped to the walls in crooked lines, and glitter scattered across the floor. Ethan stood with the other families, but instead of feeling like an intruder, he felt a sense of belonging he had once thought was forever denied to him. The girls waved at him from the stage, their small faces lit up with excitement, their voices joining the chorus of songs they had rehearsed for weeks. He clutched the program in his hand, his throat tight with emotion, as he realized he was witnessing not just a milestone in their young lives, but in his own. For years he had dreamed of fatherhood only to have it stolen by lies. And now, in this imperfect but real moment, he was living it. Juliet stood by his side, her posture calm, her expression serene. And though they didn't speak, he felt her presence as steady as an anchor. There had been no declarations between them, no dramatic reconciliations. Instead, there had been a slow rebuilding, a quiet layering of trust and respect that had grown stronger with each shared day. He knew she hadn't forgotten the pain of the past, but she no longer wore it as a shield. Instead, she wore gratitude for the present, and in her calm gaze, he saw something he had never expected to find again: a willingness to let life move forward. When the ceremony ended, he held the hands of both girls as they ran down the steps, their small diplomas clutched with pride in their arms. The sunlight bathed them in gold, their laughter ringing out as they led him and Juliet toward the crowd of celebrating families. He realized then that what had once been broken had not disappeared, but had been transformed into the foundation of something stronger. Not flawless, but resilient. Not perfect, but true. The fractures of the past remained, but they no longer defined him. They no longer defined them. That night, after the celebration had quieted, and the girls had crashed in bed from pure excitement, Ethan found himself on the porch with Juliet, the air fresh and smelling of summer promise. He turned to her not with rehearsed words, but with the simple impulse of a man who had finally learned to speak with clarity. He suggested a weekend away, a trip to the mountains, where the four of them could escape routines and distractions, where they could breathe the silence of the pines and let them chase butterflies on winding trails. For a moment, she studied him, her eyes unreadable, and he braced himself for doubt. But then she smiled, softly, firmly, and said yes. Her answer carried no weight of reluctance, no shadow of bitterness, only the simple truth that families belong together. In that instant, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt since childhood, the sensation of coming home. It wasn't a return to a house or a life he once knew, but the arrival in a place he had never truly been before. It was a home made not of walls, but of laughter, of forgiveness earned, of love rediscovered in its simplest form. And as he looked at Juliet in the fading light, he understood that the journey was not over, that there would still be struggles and mistakes ahead. But for the first time, he welcomed them, because this time, he wasn't walking alone.